We have some other upcoming events here at NAASR that have definite. He's taught there since 1998, and he coordinates the college's Center for the Study of Human Rights, which he has done since 1999. His research and publications focus on genocide and human rights, with particular emphasis on the denial of genocide, which is a unfortunately very timely issue, of course, the long-term impact of genocide and mass violence, their ethical and political implications, and mass violence against women. He's lectured widely to general, academic, and youth audiences alike. He received a PhD in philosophy from the University of Massachusetts at Amherst, and I would like to add that Henry and I grew up in adjoining towns in New Hampshire, are about the same age. Our mothers know each other, and yet we managed somehow not to meet each other until a couple of years ago. Maybe that tells you something, I don't know. I had the good fortune last year to hear a version of the presentation that Henry is going to give tonight at UCLA at the conference in honor of the 90th anniversary of the Armenian Genocide, and I was fascinated, as were the entire audience, by the interestingly different perspective he has on this material. So you're about to hear that, and please welcome Dr. Henry Theriault.
Thank you very much, Mark, and everyone else at NAASR for having me. It's an honor to be here. For many years I've come to different events, and it's nice to be up here as well. And also, I should say, not only were we in adjoining towns, but if anyone knows that area of New Hampshire, we were about the only Armenian families for miles and miles around, and somehow I still didn't know. I heard about you though, and my family was amazed when I met you here. Let me also announce one other event, if I can do that. At Worcester State on March 8th, which is a Wednesday night at 8 p.m., we're having what I think is a really interesting program sponsored by our Human Rights Center. Last summer, when the Republic of Karabakh was having its elections, which were a real test of where it was going in terms of democracy and so forth. And it's a very interesting time in this development of this state, whose existence is really about trying to assert a kind of real democracy for Armenians in the face of a very oppressive Azerbaijani government historically. And we were fortunate enough to get involved with a project with Global Exchange, which is a very famous and well-respected international human rights organization based in San Francisco, that does, among other things, election monitoring. And we ended up sending 2 professors from Worcester State to Karabakh to observe the elections, along with 2 other people from Global Exchange, to observe the elections, to meet with all sorts of different parties, to register complaints about different issues that came up. And they had to do a report and so forth, and they're actually going to be sharing their findings on Wednesday night. And we're also hoping, it's a little, next Wednesday, not this Wednesday coming up. And we're also hoping, it's still a little bit up in the air, but one of the leaders of a very progressive political party in Karabakh might actually be coming as well, if we can work it out. So it should be very exciting. And also Antoine Kasparian, who does development work and other types of things. For the Tufenkian Foundation is also going to come up. He was kind of showing our professors around, and making sure they didn't get lost and end up in a different country or something at the time they were there. So so it should be a very interesting evening. If you want more information, just let me know. I can provide that after the program today. And I can't resist. Are you
putting that on Menk and on NAASR?
I'll email it to Mark. I've been trying to send it around to different lists to let people know, but I'll definitely do that. It's a good suggestion. Thank you. I also can't resist, before I get into the discussion that I'm about to get into, just touching on this denial issue that's come up again with the Armenian Genocide film. It's been coming up a lot actually in the last year, and I'd like to say a couple things about that because I can't resist. One thing is I've been trying to get away from talking about denial and focusing too much on denial now. Not because I don't think it's an important issue, but because I think it also takes up so much of a lot of people's energy to deal with it. You all know this, right? You have to struggle very hard against denial, and it keeps us, and I think this is one of the things that I'd like to talk about in terms of the paper I'm presenting tonight, it keeps us from looking at, in some ways, the deeper issues of the Armenian Genocide, and particularly the issues of the Armenian Genocide that I think are really important for thinking about how lessons from the Armenian Genocide can be applied to prevention of genocide in the future. We get sidetracked, and we have to get sidetracked in dealing with just the basic issue of denial, and you know, in a sense, people maybe outside of the Armenian community forget this, maybe inside the community forget this. It's not just about Armenians suffering because of denial, but it's the world suffering because we're not learning from this genocide. We're just trying to fight to establish the fact that it even happened. And I should also say the technique that's being used around this film, and I just read the article that came out on the, I can't remember, it's WCET, the LA PBS station that is not going to show the documentary for various reasons. They claim that they just had other things on their agenda. I mean, you know, who knows? But I think one of the things that's very striking about this is that the technique that's used here is not always, I mean, there's outright denial by, you know, Turkish groups and pro-Turkish groups and, you know, and other groups that are involved with this. But their goal is just to stir up a lot of controversy, because a group like PBS, and PBS is in a weird position over the last 5 years, as soon as something becomes controversial, they tend to back away. And you saw that when they were having all the political fights over whether, you know, they were left-wing bias and all this kind of stuff, and they really have backed away from a lot of their harder-hitting kinds of work that they used to do. I mean, they produced, and they still produce some good work. I think Frontline is really exceptional. But they've done a lot. I mean, they had a great, one of the great, I think, documentaries on genocide was on the Rwandan genocide they did in 1998 called The Triumph of Evil, which I think is amazing. I mean, it's just, it's incredibly well done. And I'm worried that this whole kind of push, you know, political push in the general sense against PBS, but also this particular issue around the Armenian Genocide is going to be a real problem for them to be able to do this kind of work in the future. I think that's something that we as people in the United States should be very concerned about. I mean, I think PBS can fill a really important role, and we need to make sure that it keeps doing that. I think the Armenian Genocide fits into that, and it's really important in that way. I'd also like to say, I had one other point about denial, and I can't remember what it was, but there are many points about denial to make. Sorry, I was just trying to think off the cuff here. That's all right. I'll probably think of it halfway through my talk, and I'll mention it to you. What I'd like to talk about tonight is an issue that is something that kind of was in the back of my consciousness somehow as I, you know, kind of over the years have read more and more about the Armenian Genocide, and particularly about what actually happened to Armenians. And also, as I've read more and more about other genocides and the way in which they were practiced, and particularly the kind of cruelty that was visited on the victims, those who were killed and those who actually survived. And sometimes, you know, if you look at Bosnia, for instance, a lot of the women who were sexually tortured, the intent wasn't to kill them, but it was actually to do something worse, in my estimation, which was to destabilize the community by having them, you know, so traumatized that they would, inside of their communities, prevent a return of refugees and so forth, which is a significant thing. And this, you know, I hadn't thought about it until about a year or two ago. But this always somehow struck me as a little bit, I would say, in tension with the way a lot of times we see genocide presented, which is as this process where these kind of megalomaniac, you know, planners and executors of genocide just kind of get this idea and then just almost dispassionately put it into practice. We have this image of the Nazis, for instance, as this almost cold, bureaucratic / industrial machine that just kind of killed people without almost recognizing that they were doing that at all. It was almost like they were processing, and I don't mean to make this a disrespectful kind of thing, but it was almost like they were processing animals or meat or something in a factory when you read, you know, some of the accounts of this kind of thing. But when you read other accounts, it seems like something very different was going on. In fact, you know, the Holocaust with the Armenian Genocide, Rwanda is another very important case, Bosnia is a very important case, and a lot of other cases as well, if you look at them historically, were really incredibly, just brutally cruel in the way that people were killed, and they were killed very inefficiently. Now, this goes against, or this idea that I've been working with goes against the general, general kind of reigning framework for understanding genocide, which is that genocide happens because the people who perpetrate genocide come to think of their victims as less than human. And in fact, this very interesting scholar, a Canadian philosopher on the Holocaust, Andre Minot, actually argues not only were Jews dehumanized, they were actually thingified, they were turned into things at the extreme. So there's a whole literature on this. Generally people talk about the psychological process. Armenians became, you know, objects. They didn't have feelings anymore from the Turkish perspective. not only did they not have rights or legitimacy, it wasn't just second-class citizenship, it was even lower, right? And that's the argument. And the idea is, once that happens in the minds of one group relative to another group, it becomes very easy to kill these people. It's like killing ants in a sense. You know, you got an infestation of ants in your kitchen, and you know, you don't think so much about the suffering of the ants when you do that, I guess, if they're getting into your food and making your life miserable, right? They're just ants, so we don't take it very seriously. At least, you know, within the Western tradition. I mean, there are certain religious traditions that would take that seriously. And so the model of genocide is almost like this just kind of extermination of things that don't even matter, almost don't register in the consciousness of the perpetrators. It's almost beneath them to even worry about exactly what they're doing. And that kind of approach really struck me as very different from a lot of what you read about what happened on the ground, how people were killed. And in essence, also, I think, in the minds of some of the perpetrators, when they really came out and talked about things or planned policies, I think it goes against some of that. I'm going to get into that a little bit as we go, but hopefully everyone understands this idea of dehumanization, okay, is really the way people tend to think about this. And I think that's an ethical issue. Not that they're bad for thinking of it this way. I think it makes sense to think of it this way. Dehumanization is part of the process of genocide. But I think it's grounded actually in this Socratic Platonic, and I'm going to be a philosopher for a moment. I should mention, by the way, this is not a historical work. This is a philosophical analysis. And I hope that's a good thing. I'm adding maybe a different angle from what you may experience quite a bit, which is a lot of really good historians doing really good historical research and historiographic analysis. This is a little bit of a different spin. For me, there's a kind of ethical reason that people tend to like the dehumanization model and kind of stick with it to the point now where it's just generally assumed. I mean, people don't even debate whether that's really what happened. They kind of assume that as the framework they use to look at a genocide, including the Armenian Genocide, and in a way almost forget to see the things that don't fit that model. And as I said, it comes from this idea, it's discussed in the Meno, for instance, which is an early Platonic dialogue that features probably the historical Socrates discussing ethical issues. And Socrates basically argues in the Meno at one point that wrongdoing is a matter of lack of knowledge or understanding. Okay? People aren't evil because they mean to be evil. People don't harm people because they think, I'm going to harm this person because I really want to harm this person. Okay? And it's a subtle argument in some ways, and it doesn't always work that. I mean, if you read it carefully, you can raise a lot of questions about it. But there's an underlying concept there that I think is very important, and it's something that's very much a part of our, I think, the kind of Western tradition and other traditions as well. That's interesting. That is that we tend to think of people who do wrong as essentially mistaken, having done wrong by mistake. And I think the dehumanization model of genocide fits into that way of thinking. That is, people, especially people who are on the ground, villagers in Turkey or Kurdish raiders or somebody like that, who participated in the genocide or maybe even were bystanders, kind of encouraging bystanders of some of the festivals of cruelty that happened to deportation caravans and inside villages that were being deported or not being deported. That there's a model that says, yes, they did really bad things, but they didn't know what they were doing. They didn't understand it. And if they could have understood it, okay, hadn't been victims of propaganda and so forth, then, things that happened wouldn't have happened. Oh, I'm sorry. You're going too fast? Okay, I'll try. All right. Sorry about that. Because everyone, I'll check in too to make sure you're following me. So, again, it's philosophy, so it can be a little tricky. We've got all night. All night? Okay. Well, believe me, I can go 3 hours without taking a breath, and I don't think anyone wants that. So if you think of it this way, the dehumanization model is part of a bigger way of thinking about the world. And it's, in my view, a very optimistic way of thinking about things like genocide. Yeah, maybe there are some really bad perpetrators. Talat, okay, bad guy. But if you look at the general set of people who participated in the genocide against Armenians, mainly Turks, who participated at various levels, even at very high levels, they participated on the dehumanization model because they didn't know any better, that they didn't appreciate the fact that they were killing people. Does this make sense? I mean, I don't agree with it, but I mean, and this has a lot of implications when people talk about genocide. It has implications when people talk about how you change a society from committing genocide. It has implications about how we think about the process of why genocides happen, and also what can be done after genocides happen to resolve the relations between perpetrators and victims. Okay, and I'll touch on that later in the paper. What I argue, and in various ways, but the particular point that I argue is that if you look at the way Armenians were killed, and you look even at the planning and concept of the genocide at the high levels of the Turkish government at the time, really the Young Turk movement, the CUP, Committee of Union Progress, Talat, Enver, Jamal, these guys that you're probably familiar with. If you look at that in fact what they were doing was maximizing the cruelty against Armenians. That is, that it wasn't just about killing Armenians. It was about killing them in the most brutal ways possible, such that the brutality was almost more important than the killing. And I don't mean that they weren't trying to kill Armenians, but there was a point at which the cruelty was the central focus in a lot of ways. Okay? And I think a lot of times people make arguments, and they make this especially in the case of the Armenian Genocide, in the case of the Holocaust, in the case of Rwanda. I've read some things like this, and other cases as well, that, for instance, the killers were trying to be as efficient as possible. Okay, they try to kill people as quickly and as and with as least effort as possible, if you can think of it that way. Everything, for instance, they'll give evidence. For instance, in the case of the Armenian Genocide, you may have read testimony or eyewitness testimony or accounts of one way that Armenians were killed was 2 Armenians would be tied together and then thrown into a river, a body of water, and then one would be shot and drag the other one down to drown, if you're familiar with this. And the argument was that I've read for this, which struck me as wrong, but again, now I'm starting to understand, I think, why, was that was a way of efficiently killing Armenians with you could kill 2 with 1 bullet. That was the idea, right? It saved resources. And in the conditions of the Ottoman Empire at that time, they're at war, they're at a war that they're not doing very well in, and so they needed to save their resources as much as possible. So being more efficient in using 1 bullet for 2 people instead of 2 was, this efficiency argument. You hear other things. Why use bayonets, for instance, or they used a lot of knives and bayonets for killing Armenians, not guns. Okay, they didn't waste ammunition that way and so forth. And even in terms of, I know Hilmar Kaiser gave a talk here a few years ago. I think it was here when he said that that even the deportations themselves were structured as a way. The reason why the deportations happened was to give a very efficient way of separating Armenians from their property. That is, you removed Armenians from their immovable property, which is land and houses and things like that, and also their movable property. And in essence, if you're rounding them up quickly, they can't take or convert all their valuables into something that they can carry along, whether that was money or something else that was small enough to carry with them. And then again, there's something to that argument. But I always, I thought about that and I was like, okay, well, that would make sense if you were saying that they were removing Armenians for about an hour outside of town, right? You march them for about an hour and then kill them, right? And then you've moved them from the property, you've done everything you need to do. But why march them around a desert for weeks or months, right? Why get into this elaborate scheme of taking people in this long, long process of killing them? Not killing them directly, which with a knife isn't going to cost you any resources anyway. But in fact, having people starve to death, die of heat exhaustion under desert conditions, be slowly preyed upon, by different groups, and so forth. Why do that? And again, this efficiency, it seems like an incredibly inefficient way to kill people, right? And I don't mean to be cold about the way I'm talking about this or insensitive, but and hopefully you understand that. But I'm trying to think about why, this kind of thing would happen. In fact, if you think of the resources that the Young Turk government used to actually kill Armenians in this way, it was considerable, right? They had to have gendarmes, local police, paramilitaries, and so forth, and oftentimes soldiers involved in these caravans for weeks and months. Okay, they had to organize things in all sorts of ways, in a way that was much more complicated than just killing people directly. And they had to do a lot of other things like that. It seemed like a very significant waste, particularly of military-capable people, of men, soldiers, who could have been fighting at a front. Why do it this way? It was very inefficient. Okay? But I also want to talk about not just the inefficiency aspect of it, but the cruelty. And again, I don't want to be too graphic about this because we probably have all read plenty about the Armenian Genocide in terms of the horrible things that happened. But I do want to talk about the ways in which people were killed. I mean, people were killed in, I think I used the term already, festivals of cruelty, okay? People weren't killed immediately. That would be easy, right? I have to say this, and again, I don't mean to be too graphic, but women were raped to death. Actually, not just women, girls and women were raped to death. And if you can think about that, that's a horrible, it's a horrible process, and it's a long process, okay? And you can read some of the eyewitness testimonies in the U.S., like the archives by consular officials and missionaries and so forth, talk about these kinds of things happening. And they use a lot of euphemisms and so forth, but if you read between the lines, you understand exactly what's going on. You know, I mean, if you think about what was visited upon, and I think Mark mentioned that I'm focusing a lot on violence against women in genocide, because that's something with the Armenian genocide and with a lot of other genocides that's been very ignored. It's a very important issue that needs to be discussed a lot more and researched a lot more. But one of the issues, if you think about also in this context, is the fate of pregnant women or mothers. Okay, and if you understand, I mean, anyone who's familiar with some of the things that were done to pregnant women, which, interestingly enough, were almost identically done to Bosnian women in the 90s, cutting open a woman's stomach to pull out the fetus. In fact, there was, I remember reading one source that said that Turkish soldiers would gamble on which sex it would be. Some of you may see ahead, yeah, I've heard about this. Another sport that I've also read about is tossing babies in the air and trying to catch them on bayonets, which is like, you know, beyond, I mean, all these things are beyond comprehension almost for human beings, but they were practiced with a kind of regularity. And all sorts of things like this. But even the deportation caravans themselves, if you think about them as mechanisms of killing people, right? It was, I mean, it's bad to kill somebody no matter what, right? But if you take a mother and say a 2-year-old child, and you put them on a march for a month, okay, and the child basically slowly starves to death or dies of heat exhaustion over the first 2 weeks, and the mother goes through that agony of dealing with that, I don't mean to rank killings as better or worse, but I think that adds a layer of psychological torture that goes beyond just immediately killing people, okay? And I think a lot of men, even in the Ottoman military, who were killed, remember how they were killed. Some of them were massacred outright by machine gun squads. But a lot of them were worked to death. And they were worked in these horrible work brigades where they basically, it's very similar, again, Native Americans went through this in different slave conditions in the U.S., particularly in the Southwest under the Spanish. You know, Jews went through this, and a lot of other groups when they had work camps or enslavement conditions. And Armenians went through this as well in the military and in other contexts. But they, you know, this is a long period. Yeah, you're getting, in a sense, free labor, so I guess there's a utility argument that you can make, an argument that says this is beneficial for the Turkish state to use these people until they die. But anyone who has studied slavery, say in the U.S., knows that one of the primary concerns of people who are really trying to develop a slave system is the health and welfare of the slaves, because they're the labor producers, you keep them healthy. If you are working people to death, that's a very different kind of attitude and system, okay? And so I would argue that death, of course, was the outcome of this and the intent, but it was a death that was long, slow, painful, humiliating, which probably doesn't even enter into it at a certain point. You can't even think at that level. I mean, I can't imagine going through this myself, but psychologically you lose so much of your humanity through this process that it's fairly devastating, or incredibly devastating. And so if you think about some of these things, and again, we could unfortunately, you know, continue on in this vein for the next hour and just, you know, begin to exhaust some of the torments that were visited on people, on Armenians who were people, which is a point that's very important, I think, in all of this. Now, given all this, my first point hopefully makes some sense. That is that the reason, or the kind of mode of the Armenian genocide was not just about killing Armenians. It was about inflicting an incredible level of torment, torture, however you want to put it, on Armenians in the process. And I would argue, in fact, that in a lot of cases, the inefficiency of the killing was in fact part of the desired effect by the people doing the killing. Okay? At the high levels, who were deciding to use deportation caravans, and who knew exactly what was happening on the ground. I mean, they were, you know, Talat and so forth. I mean, they knew what they were doing. Questions of intent are really misplaced. And on the ground, I mean, people who were torturing, you know, people as a kind of a daily activity, okay, leading the caravans, villagers, and so forth. understood exactly what they were doing, and were inflicting this kind of incredible torture. Now, the question is, why? Why that dimension? Why is it important? What's the significance of what I'm saying? Well, I guess the first thing I would say is, at least to understand that may give us some different way of understanding the Armenian Genocide and other genocides, as I've started to point out. That is, from a moral perspective, it asks a very important question, which is, when people commit genocide, particularly people on the lower levels of the perpetrator society who participate in the killing, is it right to say that they were simply propagandized, or simply followed along, or simply didn't know what they were doing? Or should we take a stronger line? That is to say, they did understand at some level what they were doing. You can't, cut open a pregnant woman's stomach and not understand that what you're doing is, a horrific act. Okay? And what I would argue, and it's very important to point out also, and I want to stress this, that not all Turks participated in this by any stretch of the imagination. And not all Kurds that were in the areas or the groups that were involved participated in this. And I think that's an important line also to recognize. There were some really good Turks, if you understand what I mean, who really, for selfless reasons, tried to save Armenians. There were also some more or less self-serving Turks who may have had a positive benefit, that is, may have taken in orphans for their own, more or less own benefit, but at least they saved their lives, and that's certainly a benefit. And there are other kinds of things like that, okay? Or may have taken money to help people and that kind of thing. Not quite on the level of morality of somebody who did it, risking life, essentially risking their lives to help Armenians, but I think something significant that is important to keep in mind. But there were people who engaged in these horrific acts of cruelty, with what would have to appear to be some kind of self-awareness of what they were doing, okay, and intent. Now, what I want to argue is, in fact, and there are two phases of this, is in fact that this suggests, the cruelty aspect of this suggests that not only were the people who did this kind of, in a sense, aware of what they were doing, but they had to be aware that they were doing it to human beings. They had to be aware of the human status, because otherwise, torture doesn't make any sense. Okay? It is true that some people, maybe kind of disturbed kids or something like that, may torture ants, say, something like that. Or some people who are really frustrated at, because they stubbed their toe, might kick a rock in frustration. But usually those acts, if you look at them psychologically, in the case of like maybe a child who's abusing animals, happens because they personify the animals. That is, they want to make the animals suffer, and they're kind of enjoying the suffering. And in a lot of cases, those kids go on to be abusers of people later in their lives, particularly within their own families. And people who are familiar with a lot of the work on domestic violence and so forth in the U.S. are probably aware of that connection. And so the animal status isn't enough, even to the extent that they personify these animals, turn them into people, proxy people for themselves. Okay? They're really after making people suffer. Why is it the human status that's at stake? Well, people have memories. We have loving relationships with other people, friendships. We have a capacity for just basic empathy for people. And so the reason why killing a child in front of a parent, for instance, is so horrible for the parent is because of the complicated psychological attachment that parent has on so many levels. Because that parent will have to carry that with her or him forever, or for as long as they live, right? Even if it's only another 2 weeks, that's horrible. And I've also read accounts of women who survived the genocide who lost children, and to read how psychologically traumatized they are on so many levels, the guilt, the sense of failure to their children, the sense of just basic loss that they feel that's, you don't ever get over, I don't think. You can go on living, but it's very hard to get over. And of course we know this from other genocides as well. There's a lot of different stories of this. I always have in mind Maus. If anyone's read Art Spiegelman's Maus on the Holocaust, it's also a very touching part of it is the loss of his father's first son in the Holocaust because of a kind of mistaken decision. They wouldn't have known that to put him someplace where they thought he was going to be safe when he ended up getting taken to a concentration camp. And this kind of stuff is just unbelievably traumatic, as we can all understand, right? But it makes sense only if you're dealing with human beings, right? It doesn't make sense, even if you're dealing with animals, it doesn't make sense that much. They don't have the memory, the traumatic kind of capacity that human beings have. The ability to think in terms of ethical self-hatred. I'm guilty because my child died and I couldn't save the child, even though there's nothing any of these people could have done. They're in the context of genocide. There's no guilt there, but feeling that guilt, okay, which is all a part of this picture, okay? But even if we just look at things like rape and other kinds of tortures, again, there's the physical suffering, which is incredibly important and horrible, but there's the memory of this as it goes on, and the kind of understanding, the ability to comprehend it as it's happening in a way that's very different. And I've thought sometimes for myself, even, just as an Armenian, if you think about this in the context of the Armenian Genocide, if something bad happened to me as an individual, but I knew my family was safe and the people, my community was safe and so forth, that might be bad, right? If I knew I were going to die or something, that would be bad in a certain sense. I'd feel bad about that. But I think it would be very different when you were in the struggle where your own life was was in the process of being ended, but so was everybody else's around you. Everything that you cared about, everything that you lived for was being destroyed. Even on that level, the very concept of genocide, I think, assumes in part the desire to inflict this horrible suffering on people, on human beings, not on somehow dehumanized animals or even sub-animals, things. Okay? And I guess ironically enough, and again, this is another philosophy moment, if I can say this, the person who probably first understood this, although in a kind of a warped way, which has a very problematic relationship to the Holocaust, is a 19th century German philosopher named Friedrich Nietzsche. And I know at least one audience member over there is not very happy. We've had discussions, and I also, from a moral standpoint, Nietzsche was a mess. And in his Genealogy of Morals, a very famous work, kind of questioning the very possibility of having an ethic in a kind of what he considered a post-Christian Europe, a Europe in which science, and he kind of thought, unfortunately, science had displaced religion as a kind of ruling way of thinking about the world. And he said, once you lose religion, in a sense, you've lost this capacity to have universal values and a kind of ethics that would be based on that. And so he explores this whole problem in this history of ethics and how this all happened in the Genealogy of Morals. And one of the things he talks about on the way is the way in which, and he's also critical of Judeo-Christianity, this history, the way in which Judeo-Christianity kind of warped what he thought were the really healthy values of mankind, or humankind, I should say mankind, which were held by some ancient Greeks and Romans and so forth, and which he identified in different ways, but one of them was a healthy love of cruelty. Okay? And again, you can understand why morally, we already know this is bad stuff, but at the same time, he did more than just say cruelty is good or something simple like that. He said, and he argued very compellingly by looking at human history, or looking at least at German history and some aspects of European history, that there's a very, very strong tendency in all of us, a kind of philosophically significant common attitude that enjoys the suffering of others. Okay? Now, I hesitate to say that this is universal or that this is a good thing. Now, his argument was, if this is a natural thing, therefore it's an ethically fine thing, and what we need to do is somehow, it's pre-Freudian, but we need to figure out what all this Christianity and everything is messed us up because it's made us think that cruelty is bad and that we shouldn't do these kinds of things, and that's made human beings kind of, in a way, I guess, schizophrenic or cut, our moral life is against our true desires and so forth, and it makes us a kind of sick, race or something like that. And so he thought the solution to the problem was to kind of return to these more kind of macho, violent roots of our past. You can certainly see why Nietzsche, although I think it's unfair, he certainly wasn't a Nazi or a pre-Nazi or anything like that, but you can certainly see when you hear of some of these things, and I'm putting Nietzsche maybe in a bad light because there are other things that are much more positive in his work and contradict some of the things that I'm saying, but this is clearly there. You can see why the Nazis really liked Nietzsche as a philosophical forebear. In fact, I think at one point the Nazi Party put together 100 quotes from Nietzsche for the battlefield soldier, and he's the one that came up with the splendid blonde beast and all this kind of stuff. Okay. Setting aside, I don't mean to minimize the ethical problem of taking Nietzsche seriously. Intellectually, I think he had something very important to tell us, which is there is at least a part of human nature that willingly enjoys the suffering of others. And he actually argued, and it makes sense, not only enjoys the suffering of others when we witness it, which is why people love public executions and things like that. I mean, it's kind of a fascination. If you just think about reality TV and a lot of things, I mean, people love, and it's almost humiliation and denigration TV these days in the US in a lot of ways. People love these kinds of festivals of seeing people suffer. And he actually argued they love it most when they're causing the suffering, which gets us our connection to genocide, particularly the Armenian genocide. That is, that Nietzsche identifies a kind of philosophical / psychological way of understanding one of the maybe driving forces between at least the level of cruelty of the Armenian genocide and other genocides. So everyone, I'm going to take a moment here. Does everyone kind of understand more or less where I'm going with this? Okay, hope so. Okay. Now, I'm going to try to, 9 o'clock is good, 9:15 to finish. I want to have discussion, but I'm looking at Mark. Okay. Yeah, let me know. I mean, I don't want to, I can keep going, as I said, for a long time, but I also know it's hard to talk about this stuff and to think about this stuff, and certainly what I'm talking about is maybe the most gruesome aspect or the depressing aspect of the Armenian genocide, as if there could be any other, I guess. But you know, so I want to, focus in on that. But
Until you see this.
okay, all right. Okay, I wasn't sure because you
What's
moved.
the sign?
Yeah, the sign is, well, as long as you're not throwing anything at me to remind me to stop, that's good. I think Richard Hovnessian at the conference, the first time I spoke at a conference with his, we just about had to do that to half the people, pull them off the stage and so forth. So I've tried to learn not to do things too long. Now, there's another dimension of this. I mentioned there are 2 dimensions of this. The first thing is this Nietzsche issue, this issue of cruelty as a desired thing. Genocide, you can almost argue as an excuse for cruelty, or a way in which cruelty can be practiced. Does everyone understand that? It's not that Armenians were not targeted for genocide for other reasons as well, but there's an element in which cruelty itself was the goal of genocide. And I think that, and I mentioned this issue of women, I think rape is very important in all of this. Just in maybe the past decade or so, some people have started paying attention to the prevalence of rape in genocide. I mean, how almost universal. And I would argue, and I know this offends some people's sensibility in the case of the Armenian genocide, certainly is a hugely controversial topic in the Holocaust. And a lot of kind of reigning Holocaust scholars will refuse to even countenance this stuff, refuse to talk about it. But a lot of very, I think, impressive younger Holocaust scholars are really talking about it. It's that this stuff was prevalent. I mean, we've read about the stories of sexual slavery and abuse of women. I mean, you can't go through, despite the fact that people who were missionaries or consular officials from the U.S. who were writing about what was happening to Armenians used euphemisms, and they talked about outrages about 600 times, and you have to read between the lines to figure out what's going on there. And we're very careful not to be graphic about it. I mean, it's an incessant kind of refrain of the Armenian genocide, the abuse of women and children, and to some extent men. I mean, some men were sexually abused as well, and bears mentioning, I think, is an important aspect of this. Only in the last 10 years, really, and really because of what happened in Bosnia, have people started to talk about that. And because of a lot of other changes, I think, in the way that we think about the world and think about violence against women and take it seriously and so forth. It's no longer, at least in some circles, just seen as, well, kind of what happens in wars, what happens in genocide. It's a bad thing, and it's a thing that demands attention in its own right. And I would almost argue that for some perpetrators of the Armenian genocide, the motivation for them to be involved, and there are all sorts of motivations. Some of them were economic. Some people were motivated by economic gain. Some people, by just they had a prejudice against Armenians. Some people by other things. I would say that rape and abuse of women and girls was something that certainly motivated at least some of the people that participated. And if you look at, for instance, the special organizations of these released criminals, murderers and rapists and so forth, you start to understand that while being let loose on this population to do whatever they wanted was a kind of goal and end in itself. Kind of morally free zone was created. It was declared, Armenians, you can do anything you want to them. They are people, you can do anything you want to them. And there was an attraction to that, a very sick attraction. And if you look at, I guess I would almost say, if you look at this question, it's not so much just kind of starting to mention rape as part of genocide, but also genocide as part of the bigger problem of mass rape and individual rape that's very epidemic in our world. I think we have to take that seriously as part of understanding this aspect of cruelty and torture that's fundamental to genocide. It's not just a cold act. There are these aspects that we need to pay attention to. The second thing that I should mention, just as a point of historical reference, and we're probably familiar with the rape camps and so forth in Bosnia, and I would recommend, if anyone has a stomach for this, there's an excellent book that was done in 1994, actually it was 93 in Germany, 94 in the US, called Mass Rape. I think it's The War Against Women in Bosnia, and it was edited by Alexander Stiegelmeier, and I just taught this book for a Mass Violence of Women course that I'm teaching right now. And it gave me a lot of insights into understanding the Armenian Genocide that just were off the table by looking at Armenian Genocide, historical research, and a lot of other stuff that I know through comparative genocide studies. It's just not there. I mean, in the case of the Holocaust, this stuff is just coming out. The International Association of Genocide Scholars last summer actually had a couple of panels that were specifically on things like violence against women in the Holocaust and so forth. And this was really cutting edge stuff because there was such a kind of silence about this issue, and maybe almost denial of it, even from the people who were so concerned about the Holocaust themselves. In the case of Rwanda, for instance, we should also recognize, which is very important and is not discussed as much as it should be, compared to, for instance, Bosnia. Rape was also a very significant tool and a very specialized tool in a number of ways. One of the uses of rape in Rwanda was actually to infect Tutsi women with AIDS that they would then spread to children to wipe out the community in a kind of long-term way. And I think we always have to understand in these kinds of things that there have been genocides, certainly, of smaller groups that were completely effective. That is, total genocides that wiped out everybody. You look at some groups in the Amazon, for instance, and probably that's happened, Native American groups and so forth. But generally, especially with large groups, the perpetrators may try to kill everybody, but they certainly don't kill everybody. And one of the things that's a target, and Raphael Lemkin, who's the person who coined the term genocide in 1943, and had the Armenian genocide in his mind for 20 years before developing this world, and other genocides as well, and certainly the Holocaust, which he lost a huge number of his family members in, understood that part of the process of genocide is not just killing people, I think, as we all understand, but it's also wiping out the social structures, the political structures, the religious structures, the families, every aspect of connection and identity that people have in the groups, the group that's targeted, or the groups that are targeted, are what's at stake. And even if you don't kill everybody, if you can wipe out their society, killing a lot of people and then wiping out the rest of it, you have gotten rid of that group. And that was certainly, if we take some of the sources on Talat, maybe the most important leader in the Armenian, of executing or of planning and executing the Armenian genocide. That's really what he was trying to do. I mean, he understood that that's what he was trying to do, was just to break any possibility of Armenian cohesion, at least for 50 years. He thought he would do it at least for 50 years, which actually he was right. But in the case of Rwanda, you're raping women, which is already a hugely traumatic event that has possible consequences, particularly in a context of genocide, where they're losing family members and all sorts of things, of making them unable to function later in their lives, both physically and emotionally. It can lead to suicide. It can lead to a kind of ongoing traumatic, post-traumatic stress disorder that kind of, keeps them frozen in this state of just having been victimized in this way and so forth. But when you add in this dimension that I think is unique in the case of Rwanda, of AIDS as spreading this disease, which actually their primary point was to have it spread to the children that these women would then give birth to, so that even if these groups tried to, or the Tutsi in particular, tried to rebuild their group, they would have this added complicated problem, deep problem obviously, because a lot of the children would then die, and also the mothers would die, destabilize the society. There are a huge number of orphans now, many of them have HIV in Rwanda, who have grown up basically orphans but alone, because there's no social structure, there's no resources to help them out. So if we think about these kinds of things, there's a mechanism, there's certainly an end to destroy this group, but it's destroying them in all sorts of, just beyond just, killing people up front, which is almost, would be merciful in some sense, but all these avenues of killing people in these complicated ways and attacking women and of course also men and children and so forth. So I think it's important to keep in mind. Now there's another dimension to this. What I've said so far probably supports the idea that some people who committed the Armenian genocide at every level enjoyed doing it, and enjoyed doing it in the sense that they knew they were inflicting suffering on human beings, and that's what made it enjoyable to them, and that they embraced it and so forth. I think this analysis also leads us to a deeper, maybe, understanding of the Armenian Genocide and what I'm calling the second aspect of the humanity of Armenians. And that is on a more broad political level. If we look at what was happening, or what had happened to Armenians, particularly from 1908 to 1915, there was a huge change. Again, many of you are familiar with this, right? I mean, what happens in 1908 is the Young Turk, misnamed Young Turk Revolution. Of course, Armenians were also involved with this, as well as a lot of other groups that overthrow the Sultanate. Remember, this is the same Sultan who had, 1894-96. I mean, it's, a horribly brutal regime. It's this whole process that Armenians embraced for obvious reasons. I mean, whatever the Young Turks' problems they anticipated, they couldn't be as bad as what had already happened under the Sultanate. And more importantly, the Young Turks that they were working with had really embraced Armenians and other minorities, Greeks, Syrians, Kurds in a different way, Muslim and non-Muslim minority groups, Jews and so forth, by a promise of a real change in their status, right? And the 1908 Constitution, the revolution that kind of put into place this Constitution that had been kicking around for maybe 40 years as a possible reform, or aspects of this Constitution as a possible reform in Turkey, did something very significant. It granted Armenians citizenship rights, right? Armenians could serve in the military, they could carry guns, they didn't have to get out of the way if a Turk was walking down the street, all these kinds of things, right? All these big changes happened. That is, the whole basis of Ottoman society shifted from an empire, and by that I mean an empire that was built on conquest, where the layers of conquest were maintained in the internal structure of the empire, right? We had the Millet system, which was really a three-tiered hierarchy, right? You had Muslims who were either already Muslims, part of the Turkish, kind of people who did the conquering, or people who converted, right? Bosnians, I mean, importantly to mention, who were kind of former Serbs, Croats, whatever, who converted to Islam, kind of separated off. And so many other groups as well. And they were in the first tier, okay? And there may have been differentiations. Is that a sign to move forward? Okay, just checking. And then, of course, you had people of the book, who at least maybe Christians or Jews in the Judeo-Christian Islamic tradition, who could be recognized at least as, being part of the religious tradition that led to Islam. So Armenians, Jews, Greeks, Assyrians, and other, kind of smaller Christian groups had a kind of second-tier status. And then, of course, anybody else, there weren't that many, but, people who didn't have any of the big three established religions were kind of on the lower end. And I guess if there are any Zoroastrians or anything left in that area, I'm not sure that there were, but there was another kind of lower tier. Didn't get much play and wasn't very significant. But it's that second tier, right, that were second-class citizens. They lived in an apartheid, segregated society in many ways. I mean, it didn't mean that a lot of Armenians and other non-Muslims couldn't rise in society in certain ways, couldn't have economic wealth, as exceptions to the rule. But by and large, Armenians lived as second-class, not citizens, but subjects. They lived as a conquered people, as a subject people that is very reminiscent. And we again, in the context of discussing the Armenian Genocide, forget the whole literature on things like colonialism. But it's very much as a colonized people, as a subject people. Yes, they were allowed to go on and live, and they had their businesses and things like that. But they had significantly reduced rights. Okay, a much greater level of violence without any kind of legal ramifications was allowed to be practiced on them, particularly in the countrysides. Differential taxation, they didn't have the right to bear arms. I'm not a proponent of anybody bearing arms, but in a context where your family members may be subjected to violence, or you may be, if that's the only thing that's going to protect you, then it seems like not being able to bear arms is a very significant thing to lose, especially on the countryside where so many Armenians were preyed upon by Turks and Kurds who did have arms and horses and all these kinds of things. All sorts of other differential points of status that had a real kind of life and death significance, as well as a kind of long-term community significance. It made it harder for Armenians to kind of stay strong as a community. It made everything a challenge, politically, religiously, and so forth. Now, understanding that, and then having 1908 come here, come on the scene with this revolution, suddenly Armenians at least had a shot. I mean, no one is naive enough to think that overnight people stopped having prejudice against Armenians. People stopped, Muslims and particularly Turks stopped thinking that Armenians were really second-class citizens, and that's part of our problem. But at least there was a promise to Armenians that there was a change that could happen. That there was the real possibility of a kind of multinational, I hesitate to say democratic because I'm not sure, there was a kind of semi-democratic liberal society that some very prominent members in the Young Turk movement in a very sincere way were trying to push for. Others were pushing for it maybe a little bit more cynical way, they were seeing what was going to happen. And others were just, had no intention of seeing this kind of society come into being. But for a lot of Armenians, there's a real possibility there. And if you look at the alternatives at this point, separatism didn't look particularly good, although there's a lot, of course, there are all these arguments that deniers use that Armenians were raving separatists, they wanted to break apart the empire and deal the death blow to the empire and so forth. But if you think about it, it wasn't like Armenians could just separate from the Ottoman Empire and everything would be fine. They had a real problem over the border, which was Russia, who had itself conquered part of Armenia, or had kind of inherited an empire, including part of Armenia, and had certainly shown no great kindness toward Armenian desires for self-rule or anything like that. But also to end up being a small, relatively weak society within this clashing dynamic of these titan empires. The Ottoman Empire still, was still powerful. The Russian Empire, and then all the kind of geopolitics of that region that were emerging. People weren't stupid. If they could get a society where they could be Armenians, and this is very important, they could have their religion, their language, their sense of their identity, history, their schools, everything like that, and yet still have a reasonably workable, I say liberal society. That is a society where their rights would be protected, where they couldn't just be killed, raped, or kidnapped, or something like this, where they could actually take people to court, for bad business deals, or could try to get someone prosecuted for, murdering a family member or something like that, which didn't happen before this period. You can see there's a real promise there. And for people in a desperate situation, as Armenians were, so many Armenians were, or the Armenian community in general were, it made sense that they would embrace this. Quite the contrary of a lot of denial literature, and in line with, I think, a lot of the sources on this, Armenians were pushing for not separation from the Ottoman Empire at this time, in the 1908, say 1914, 15 period, but integration. There was a real integrationist movement, because they thought that could actually work. That could mean a real improvement that could work. And if you think about Armenian history, there's even another dimension to this. Armenians, for 2,000 or more years, okay, since the fall of the Empire of Tikhon the Great, you have the period of Cilicia, which encompasses some Armenians having an independent society. But Armenians, our national identity, to the extent that it formed in the modern period, and everything that came before that, was forged as a people that was a subject people that lived within somebody else's empire under somebody else's laws. And in some cases, Armenians participated extremely well in that. The Byzantine Empire, as probably some of you know, Armenians did had a significant role in many ways. And so, this didn't seem such a bad idea. We even had this argument in the case of the Soviet Union, if you remember, right? A lot of people argued, and there was something to this, that Armenians were better off, particularly during the Cold War, as part of the Soviet Union, where things, the Stalinist violence and so forth, but at least maybe by the 60s, 70s, things weren't horrible, compared to what could happen if they were just kind of cut loose and had to deal with that area of the world and that period of time and so forth, and a Turkey that invaded Cyprus and so on. We see this logic. It makes some sense. And there's nothing anti-nationalist about it. You can have very different ideas about national identity. And I think if you look at, and this is something that I'm concerned about, my dissertation was actually on the idea of nationalism and looking at it from alternative standpoints, for instance, diaspora nationalism and so forth. And this is something in the period since then that I've thought about. Even Armenian national identity, which certainly was heavily influenced by European, particularly French forms, this idea of a nation state, independent, its own laws and all this kind of thing, differentiated from all other nation states. That stuff was there. But there's also a sense in which Armenians developed their own concept of national identity. which allowed for integration into a bigger society. And there was nothing wrong with that. You could be Armenian and part of this. And I want to stress two things. One is, I want to really differentiate between assimilation and integration. They're very different things. The Young Turks would have been thrilled if Armenians assimilated, gave up their religion, culture, language, and just sense of identity. That would have been great. Problem solved. No Armenian question anymore because there's effectively no Armenians. Actually, probably Armenians could have kept their language. That wouldn't have been a big deal. But at some level, religion and political identity or sense of history were the two things that were really significant. Assimilation would have been fine. And in fact, the Young Turks kind of assumed, and actually earlier, the Sultan and so forth earlier, assumed that groups like the Kurds, because they were Muslims, would eventually assimilate, right? And a lot of the pressure that was applied kind of in the aftermath of the Armenian Genocide was toward that end. And we all know that that didn't happen with the Kurds. That's one of the reasons that, 30,000 people were killed, 3,000 villages in the 80s, 90s, and so forth, were razed by the Turkish government, Kurdish villages, because Kurds, many Kurds at least, refused to assimilate. They refused to give up their identity. But in any way, assimilation, that's fine. Everybody's, well, not everybody, but at least the people in power are happy because you no longer have a political opposition. But Armenians were integrationists and were expecting integration. And that posed a very significant, or we'll say unacceptable solution for at least some parts of the Young Turk movement who came to dominate. People like Ahmed Rija, and who's a very important Young Turk who even in 15 or 16, it was after the genocide was already happening, I think it was 15, when the Ottoman Parliament was debating the law that legalized the deportations. And Rija was the lone voice in the parliament who spoke against it, which is, I think, pretty amazingly courageous. Whatever his, some people say he was just incredible humanitarian, other people say, well, he had his own agenda. He was against the Young Turks that took power, the Talats and so forth, because he had a very different vision of Turkey, which unfortunately did not come to be. A kind of liberal, democratic, constitutional Turkey that would be very different, respect human rights and so forth. That would be a very good Turkey to have today, certainly for Turks and for everybody else concerned. But the critical mass of the Young Turk movement, certainly at some point between 1908 and say 1914, 15, and again, I'm not a historian, so I can't fix the date or anything like that. I know there are a lot of debates. Hakan Dajr and others debate about exactly when the Young Turks decided on the genocide and exactly how things shifted. But it's clear that there's a progression where there's at some point a critical mass that very clearly has abandoned any kind of idea of liberal democratic or liberal egalitarian maybe reform in Turkey, and has a vision, as we all know, of Turkey as a kind of both imperial power and kind of homogeneous national state. They kind of mix the two things together, okay? A kind of empire within their own borders and, of course, a resurgent empire outside their own borders. And once that became dominant, okay, to be a part of the society of Turkey, you had to be Turkish, okay? By assimilation or by, happenstance of birth. And Armenians not only wouldn't take that option or hadn't taken that option in the 1908-1915 period, and certainly I should say 1908-1913, say. Well, I'm not sure exactly when the decision to commit the genocide happened, but let's be safe that it probably happened a little bit before 1915. And again, I'm not sure, not only because I don't know, but there's a big debate among historians who are the real experts on this, exactly when this decision was taken. But at some point, it became impossible from the perspective of the Young Turk movement, or those who dominated it, to have Armenians be part of the society, okay? They couldn't have Armenians part of the society, not because the society would fail, but because it would be the wrong society. In fact, there's every possibility that had Armenians been integrated into the Ottoman Empire, as well as other groups, right, that the Turkey of today would be a lot better off. It would have a very different leadership, okay? And people like Ahmed Rija, that may have been their motivation. They may have just understood, look, it's better to have just an open society. They work a lot better and, and there's a lot of benefits there. But in any event, that couldn't happen conceptually. But the problem was this. There's all the arguments we've heard. The Armenians couldn't be expelled anywhere and, and all these kinds of things, unlike the Greeks and so forth. But I think it cuts a little bit deeper. The problem was Armenians had become human beings. They couldn't be put back in a second-class citizenship after 1908, right? When the Sultan, Abdul Hamid II, committed the 1894-96 massacres, his explicit intention was very clear, to put Armenians back in their place. Armenians had kind of gotten the idea that they could resist Ottoman rule, that they could step out of this second-class position, that they were no longer the subjects, but they could actually claim citizenship rights, or human rights, or civil rights. Okay? And so what did he do? Well, he went after specific areas where there was real organized resistance to unfair taxation and so forth. And then but more broadly, unleashed a general massacre that really went after, the viability of kind of Armenian, democratic reform, maybe civil rights movement is probably the best term to use for this, that undercut it. And his intent was very clear: push Armenians right back. Don't get out of line. You have to go right back to where you were before. The Millet system is still in place. This hierarchy is still there. And anyone who tries to step out of line, Armenian or otherwise, is going to die, or at least bring on their community tremendously horrible consequences. And that's exactly what he did. And it worked for a while, but some Armenians figured out, it certainly figured out that something had to be better than this. And the constant threat of this kind of violence and the attitude of violence and domination and so forth. And certainly many sided with, we doing okay? I'm almost there, so okay. And certainly, when the Young Turk movement and other kind of reformist liberal movements came along with this promise of a change for Armenians, okay, it makes sense that a lot of Armenians signed right on to this, right? Because this was a great chance to change things. But anyway, in doing that, Armenians became, the psychology, I think, changed at some level. You can't just go back to being a kind of serf or a slave once you've tasted at least the possibility of the hope of freedom. But also from the Turkish perspective, they realized, wait a minute, these Armenians can be part of our society. They can actually work this. Armenians were in parliament, the Ottoman parliament. Armenians were suddenly exploded on the scene, right? They had been there in different ways, but suddenly were participating more and more in Ottoman society, very successfully and very helpfully. Okay? In the military and so forth, Armenians were there, as we all know. And so, from that standpoint, Armenians no longer could be put back in their place. They had become real human beings, real equals of the Turks conceptually. And that was the thing that the Young Turk movement couldn't accept once it had this radical kind of Turkish nationalist or ultra-nationalist attitude. And so the only option was to get rid of the Armenians, right? That's the only, there was no position to put them back to, okay? If you compare this, there's a very interesting connection I'm trying to develop, and again, in many ways not a historian, and certainly not a historian of the U.S. Or details of U.S. history. But if you think about, there's been a lot of attention recently on the period of Reconstruction in the United States. Post-Civil War to about, we'll say 1890, when everything, the KKK essentially wins as well as some other people. Which is a period in which African Americans, there was an African American senator. People were, running towns. That had African American majorities. They were getting elected, and even when they did, African Americans in that period, former slaves and other African Americans, actually were participating at a level and a productive and important level in U.S. society, far beyond. Some people might even argue beyond what you have today, for various reasons. Because I think racism is incredibly intense in this country, and actually getting much worse in the past, 20 years. Participating at an incredibly high level. At the same time, there was a paramilitary reaction, as well as a kind of governmental and we'll call it, local and national governmental reaction against this threat of what the country would become if these former slaves actually were allowed just to be equal, like what they were supposed to be at some level. And when you look at, for instance, the rise of the KKK, which is really a semi-official organization at this time. It was certainly sanctioned by local governments and so forth. They were members of it, so of course they were participating in this. It looks a lot like a more extended in time version of the Ahmadiyya, the Kurdish Ahmadiyya movements that were formed by Sultan Abdul Hamid II, to do something to terrorize Armenians. The KKK was a terrorist group that really was there to put down any attempts by blacks in the U.S. to really become full participants in society. As long as they accepted a kind of return to a really significantly lower status, everything's fine. But when they got, and if you're familiar with the term uppity, that it started acting like human beings and expecting to be treated like human beings, okay? they were targeted by violence and other kinds of things, and it was a very common occurrence. Now, I don't want to get into this in too much detail. And I'm not sure I can do that right now, because I haven't looked into this. It's something I'm just thinking about now, but I'm just starting to develop recently. But there are very interesting parallels there in terms of how the reaction against a group that is kind of somehow allowed into the broader society, into the game, into the political game, that a large segment of the dominant groups eventually just refuses to tolerate there, precisely because they make it, right? I mean, as an aside, I mean, if Armenians were really inferior to Turks, you don't need the Millet system. You don't need the 1894-96 massacres. You don't need anything, because Armenians would just end up being inferior to Turks, right? I mean, they just wouldn't have succeeded in the empire. They wouldn't be a threat in any sense, right? They couldn't organize politically. They couldn't do anything. Similarly for African Americans. I mean, if slaves were really inferior to whites, why do you need laws, violent laws, that punish slaves for trying to read, right? If they're so stupid, why do you, I mean, that's the argument, right? Africans weren't rational and so forth. So why would you be so afraid of them reading? Obviously because you knew deep down that they were just like you, just as capable of whatever you could do, okay? And so this backlash, this fear of Armenians actually participating, I think is an incredibly important mechanism of the Armenian Genocide. And I think really motivated things at the higher level, or as part of the motivation. I don't mean that these are exhaustive ways of thinking about the Armenian Genocide. There are a lot of different factors that come in. But these two aspects, this cruelty aspect and then this kind of anti-democratic, anti-human, Armenians are human beings aspect, or full participants, anti-egalitarian aspect, I think are two aspects that have been relatively neglected in discussions of the Armenian Genocide that are really important. And have a lot of implications. And I'd like to close out. I mean, there are a lot of comparative points that by nature, and I've certainly done a lot on the Armenian Genocide. I'm concerned, as an Armenian about the Armenian Genocide, but I'm compelled to think about the connections to other genocides. Because I think from a moral standpoint, and just, from caring about this work and caring about what it means. And there are a lot of dimensions that we can talk about maybe in the question and answer period. I mean, I've just maybe sketched a few of them. I should also say that the point of Armenians developing, speaking of being influenced by things outside of the Armenian sphere, the point about Armenians developing their own kind of unique nationalism that took these ideas from Europe, but also, and I didn't finish that thought out, also rework them in the context of Armenian history, right? You could have a nationalism that wasn't a separatism, right? Armenians actually, we talk about all the things we did in architecture, 800, maybe 1400 years ago and so forth, which is significant. But I think also in terms of opening up alternative possibilities of national identity, Armenians had a role in that. I mean, there are a lot of other groups that did that as well. And I'm influenced my thinking, and I should give credit to this, very much by a guy named Partha Chatterjee, who's an Indian, actually I think Bengali, theorist of the Nation Forum, who wrote a critique of some very famous 1980s, kind of first big, like Benedict Anderson's first big work on what a nation is and national identity is and so forth. And basically argued that all these European American authors took an idea that fit Europe and the United States and some other nations and just kind of assumed that it applied to every other group in the world. And in fact, Anderson's kind of famous for this. And Chatterjee's first kind of big book was called Nationalism in the Colonial World. I hope I'm getting the title right. A Derivative Discourse, ? That is nationalism just a reflection of European ideas that these, colonized natives, who couldn't think up their own ideas about politics, just kind of absorbed, or something much more complicated going on? Not that these were entirely new. Certainly they were absorbing ideas from the West, but also remaking them. And I think Armenians are a good example of an earlier, relatively early group, 1890s and early 20th century, that were doing this kind of thing, reworking the very concept of what a nation could be in a very productive, I think very politically open and productive way that still has a lot of importance, I think, for our thinking about these kinds of things. And let me just add one final word on this, and that's that part of what motivated me to think through some of these issues is the discussions, and you may remember David Phillips was here, I want to say in the fall, maybe?
A year ago.
A year ago, okay, wow, time flies. And the whole issue of Tark and dialogue and reconciliation and Armenian-Turkish relations was a very important issue, and as many of you are aware, you're reading about this stuff all the time. But one dimension that is utterly missing, from my standpoint in all of these discussions, is the fact that Armenians and Turks do not exist as equals in their relations today. Yet we talk as if we're having a negotiation between equals, a dialogue or discussion between equals. And I don't mean that Armenians are inferior to Turks or anything like that. But what I do mean is that Armenians, because of the genocide was not just a thing that happened and ended. It has ramifications for the long-term relationship between Armenians and Turks. In fact, it consolidated, okay, a dominance relation of Turks over Armenians. I mean, just think about, we talked about this film, right? It's a movie, I mean, I shouldn't say movie, it's a film, a documentary about the Armenian Genocide, and yet it's not being shown in some places. I mean, that's an incredible amount of power, okay? It's an incredible amount of power. To be able to stop, and it's not even an Armenian community initiative, right? It's just, you know, I mean, there are Armenians involved in this, but I mean, it's even an outside actors that are involved with this. And to be able to stop that from happening, it's just an incredible, maybe, illustration of the kind of power that we're talking about. And from my standpoint, understanding that the genocide itself was about not putting Armenians back in their place because there's no place left, but about asserting a kind of radical super dominance over Armenians. I mean, that's what genocide really is. It's so much dominance that you're actually eliminating the other group. Even those who survive are eliminated. Okay? And I think this is also an important way to talk about genocide. We often talk about genocide as it ends, and then somehow the people get humanized again, and everyone's kind of sorry, and the perpetrator society wakes up from their dream that they didn't know what they were doing, and then we kind of move on. It's an aberration in history. But it's not an aberration. In a lot of cases, particularly partial genocides, the very intent is to assert dominance over the target group. You kill part of the group. This is the 1894-96 massacres were exactly this. It's a partial genocide, where you kill part of the group to try to dominate the rest of the group. And there are many other cases. Nanjing Massacre is a famous example. Japan, 1938, trying to force China into surrender into a colonized society, committed a partial genocide, killed 100 to maybe 250,000 people in the capital of Nanjing. It backfired, but their intent was to intimidate. And so we have to also think about genocide as what happens after it. Native Americans, classic example in terms of the aftermath of genocide. And if you look at the debates in 1890-91 and the discussions in this country about whether we needed to actually kill off every last Native American, and people had these debates. L. Frank Baum's the 1 minute? Is that good? All right. L. Frank Baum, Wizard of Oz, guy who wrote The Wizard of Oz, also was an advocate of exterminating every single Native American on every reservation in the country. I hated Wizard of Oz, by the way, when I was a kid. I was scared. My mother wouldn't let me watch it because I was so afraid of it. But maybe there's a sadistic thing that comes out of this. For all the rhetoric about him being a populist and all this kind of stuff, I mean, he argued in 1890 after the Wounded Knee Massacre, which effectively ended the possibility of military resistance by Native Americans in this country. He said, why even bother keeping any of them alive? They're nothing, they're dirt, they're a shame to themselves and to everybody else, so let's get rid of them all. It didn't happen, and my argument for why it didn't happen is that Native Americans, 200,000 people at that point in the U.S. on reservations, half starved, half dead, nobody cared anyway. The U.S. government was satisfied that there was no Native American problem. And that the Native Americans, you know, in terms of land and all sorts of other things, were effectively dominated in a kind of a super domination. So you don't need the rest of the genocide. It did what it was supposed to do. And I think these things are very important to understand when we start thinking about the long-range consequences of genocide in maybe a different way from some of the models that we have. And hopefully we'll take this into account when we talk about reconciliation with Turks today. That there's a deeper issue of our relationship with Turks that goes far beyond just trying to get over trauma. That this is a deeper problem of a real structural political domination that hasn't been addressed. I want to thank you for your very patient and kind attention. Thanks again to NAASR, to everybody for being so kind to host me. I'm happy to answer questions, talk.
Yes, George.
I wanted to thank you for that fascinating and in-depth talk. It was the best I've ever heard.
Thank you. I probably certainly don't deserve it, but thank you.
My question is basically, how much concern was there at the time about keeping this confidential or hiding what was going on? I know you mentioned in your talk about the morality issue, making it acceptable to torture and kill Armenians, but at any time was there any concerted effort to keep this from disseminating into the outside civilized world?
I mean, I can only answer that based on historians who have actually done that work. But yes, there was. I mean, certainly, you know, the deportations were presented as just that, deportations for the safety of Armenians and Turks and so forth. And so it wasn't presented as a genocide. At the same time, you know, certainly Henry Morgenthau knew exactly what was going on and told Talat, as far as we know, exactly what was going on. At least he relates that in his book, Ambassador Morgenthau's story, and goes back and forth about that. But there's one passage actually in this paper that I didn't convey to you that I think suggests, at the high levels even, the kind of attitude about this, but it also addresses your question about almost the pride of committing genocide. It's something we have to think about. In a conversation Morgenthau apparently had with one government official in, I think it was I'm assuming it's in Istanbul, that's where he was, during the genocide. This individual was actually a torturer of Armenians. And you might think, well, what were they doing to torture Armenians at this time? I mean, there's no apparent reason for it. Where were they going to get information? They knew where all the Armenians were, and half of them were dead by that point anyway. And there was no organized resistance and so forth. So clearly torture was about something else. And if you read the account that Morgenthau had, actually, let me just read that. It's just a short thing, if I can find it. It really sheds light into this cruelty issue, but also, this guy was blatant about it. I mean, he explained that this whole set of, you know, Young Turk operatives met regularly, like every night, at the Young Turk headquarters in Istanbul to talk about their torture techniques and to innovate. I'm going to find this for you. To innovate and so forth. And they were just like almost bragging about this to Morgenthau. So at one level, yeah, they're covering things up officially, they're denying whatever. But at another level, they're kind of proud about what they were doing, which speaks, again, of this imperialist mentality, or imperial mentality of just being so powerful that, you know, you just have the right to do, I mean, you have the right to do whatever you want to anybody. They're human beings, great, who cares? We're superhuman. And I say that with a very good point, because remember, Nietzsche, if you don't know this, came up with the concept of the Übermensch, the superman, that gets warped. He didn't mean it the way that Hitler used it, but it gets warped into Nazi ideology as Germans as the Übermensch, the super race, superhumans, such that, of course, Jews are dehumanized, but, you know, there's a whole hierarchy of people, even, you know, French were lower and whatever. I mean, this idea of this super dominance and this right to do whatever you wanted to anybody because you just had a special status in the world is very disturbing, and you see this in here. Just to give you an idea, the pleasure they're deriving from this, by the way, is clear. In the discussions Morgenthau had, each new, he said, you know, he described it, each new method of inflicting pain was hailed as a splendid discovery, and the regular attendants were constantly ransacking their brains in the effort to devise some new torment. The official told Morgenthau that these are Morgenthau's words, by the way, except I put it the official in Morgenthau instead of he told me, that they even delved into the records of the Spanish Inquisition and other historic institutions of torture and adopted all of the suggestions found there. He did not tell Morgenthau who carried off the prize in this gruesome competition to be the best torturer. But common reputation throughout Armenia gave a preeminent infamy to Jevet Bey, the Valley of Van, who some people may have heard about. I mean, this was like a game, a thing, you know, an enjoyable practice, okay, which resonates with some of the other things I was talking about before, and also shows up in other genocides. The famous 100 beheadings contest that the two Japanese soldiers engaged in the Nanjing massacre is an example where they tried to see who could be the first to behead, you know, 100. Well, the way it was reported in Japan was 100 enemy combatants, and they, you know, the picture was these Chinese soldiers with, you know, rifles, and these, you know, Japanese soldiers with just their swords, you know, going in and beheading people. In fact, what they were doing was taking, oftentimes, tied prisoners of wars and civilians, you know, putting them on their knees and just trying to hack their heads off. And they weren't always very good at it. It took a while sometimes to do that. It was a horrible way to kill people. And it shows up in other kinds of ways. These kinds of contests and games of torture that replace any kind of normal, I mean, you know, people may say football's a little violent, but I mean, you know, or hockey or something, but I mean, it just replaces that on a totally different level, but it's experienced the same way. It's just fun, good, clean fun. So if that answers, and they're proud about this, so I mean, that's the best answer I can give. And I should say that this passage is what, a couple of years ago when I was rereading this, really got me thinking about this whole topic of this paper, because this didn't fit the model that I've been handled, so I had to really deal with it.
Henry, the main point I was trying to bring up is the main reason why Theriault exterminated the Armenian people is because of the post-Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire, as you know, was a great empire that went all the way up into Europe, Northern Africa, Middle East, and as they removed the reason they removed the sultans is because they saw that empire deteriorating over the centuries. And in order to save what they had left, which was Asia Minor, they had to eliminate the Armenian people who were controlling the trades and all the businesses within the country. And if they didn't eliminate the Armenian people, they were going to get their independence along with the Kurds, the Greeks, and whatever. So I feel as if that was the main reason why Theriault and his cabinet eliminated the Armenian people, and that's a key issue that I think maybe you can address.
I mean, the way I can address it is to say, I understand the separatist argument and the fear of this had a role in Young Turk thinking, but my argument is very different, that in fact, the problem for the Young Turks was not that Armenians were going to separate or were opposed to them, but in fact, that they were going to participate in the Ottoman Empire and change what it was, change it into a non-Turkish empire, and that was the thing that couldn't be accepted. And that door was opened by some Young Turks themselves, right? I mean, the door was opened by Ahmad Rija and others to invite Armenians in, and I think that that's something that I really want to focus on as well. I mean, I'm not saying and this is a way of looking at the Armenian genocide, certainly not the only way, but I think there are a lot of elements there that can help us understand certain aspects that haven't been discussed so much in the past. But thank you for your
Up front and then back.
In your research,
George,
we got a letter.
One second, George.
I can wait.
No, go ahead, please.
Okay. Theriault says that we all have an innate capacity for violence. We're born with that. And your statements, first of all, I could listen to you for hours.
Well, you're about the only person, but thank you.
And your theory that much of this was done because individuals enjoyed the cruelty and the torture. My question is, do you have an answer about what ignites this in individuals, why they do it? I mean, where do we begin?
Let me say, as to Israel Charney, I think the world of him, and he's one of the reasons I do this work. Hard to read? Yeah, well, he can jump around. I mean, he's done some great work, tremendous work. And he's got a book coming out, actually. I haven't seen the whole book. It's been taking a long time to get out. But I saw a presentation he did a few years ago, and in fact had wrote him an email that ended up being part of he had some comments on the book and so forth that ended up, because I thought what he had to say was really good, which is this kind of give and take. I mean, it's somewhat of the kind of Freudian way of thinking there's kind of good and evil, or the death instinct and the life instinct, that kind of thing. But he's really thinking about that. He's doing psychology from a political standpoint, like trying to take seriously all these horrible things that happen in the world, and then trying to think of the psychology behind them. And I think he's a valuable person. He's maybe hard to read, but a valuable person on these kinds of things. I'm trying to think about this. I mean, I kind of look at it from more of an ethical standpoint than a psychological standpoint, and I'm almost a hard liner on that. That I don't care what the, what the process was. What I care about is, could the person have done something different? What decision did that person make? What options did they have, and so forth? And I think when it comes to genocide, that people always have options. I mean, there's a real tradition of, I think, good scholarship. Even Jean-Paul Sartre, Being in Nothingness is, again, talk about hard to read. I tortured students with that. I shouldn't use that word, but with students with one semester, and it didn't. They did well. They were brave, but it was a hard thing. But he talks about, you always have a choice. And he wrote that book under Nazi occupation of France, and basically wrote it as a veiled way to tell French, look, those who are collaborating, who claim to have no choice, you have a choice. You always have a choice to make a decision. And as long, it's just a question of whether you're willing to deal with the consequences. If you're willing to die to continue to be a good person, then you have that choice. If you're not, then you've made a choice. And I think that's something that goes along with a lot of this. I mean, I should say, you're asking a great question. I don't know if I can answer it, but again, that book on Bosnia that I mentioned actually does some interviews. It's disturbing and also really enlightening, or really helpful to understand this, with some of the men who committed the mass rapes, to find out what they were thinking, why they were doing it, and you get, there's all these kinds of process of what's going on that, you know, raises all sorts of questions. I mean, certainly they had some idea of what they were doing. They had no other way of doing it. And even as they try to rationalize it after the fact, because they kind of knew something was wrong about what they were doing, they still, you know, understood how bad. I mean, one guy really understood that it was bad, and, you know, just had to kind of deal with that. But you know, it's a question. I mean, you know, I give people a lot of credit.
Thousands of people were participating in
Yeah.
that cruelty.
Yeah.
What makes them
Against
do
former
that?
neighbors? Yeah, no, I think there's all sorts of answers to that in terms of, I mean, I think people can be really bad, and I think that it doesn't always take that much. I mean, I look at, you know, I mean, people will let other people die all the time. It happens in our society, it happens in other societies. If people think they're right about something, sometimes they're just willing to kill, or they think they have the right to kill. For me, in the Armenian Genocide, what I think I'm arguing is, when a group has an attitude of superiority over others, that's the danger. It's not the dehumanization so much, that's part of it, but it's the attitude of superior ethical right, the right to do whatever you want. And as soon as you do that, you've granted yourself whatever desire you have. You want somebody's food, you know, you do whatever you need to get it, you know, that kind of thing. And I think it's a pervasive mentality. I mean, I think we see it in our society and in every society. But I don't know if you know, maybe that's a question we can't answer. It's a truly philosophical one, so I appreciate it. But
Ken and George?
yeah.
I'm interested in your studies. Did you have any views, particularly on the female survivors in the 1920s, 1940s, 1960s, 70s? What impact, after seeing all these horrific
Yeah.
experiences, what effect did it have on the women?
My gosh, that's a great research topic that I certainly haven't. I mean, I haven't done, although I think it's important. And I mean, there's just not that much on that in the Armenian Genocide. I mean, there's been a few kind of long-term trauma psychology studies, but very little of substance. The really good work on this, if you've ever read Miller and Miller's oral history of the Armenian Genocide, anyone ever read this? I'm sorry? Survivors, yeah, the oral history of the Armenian Genocide. They're the only, I mean, they're really the only major source on the Armenian Genocide that really tries to deal with the fate of women as it happened. Now, they don't deal with the long-term effects, but of course they're interviewing survivors who kind of saw things happening and so forth. Well, you know, they were interviewing in the 70s, 80s, and so forth, 60s, 70s and 80s, that's right. But they actually try to think about those kinds of issues. But yeah, I mean, that's a great, I mean, I don't think people weren't even asking those questions. They weren't even acknowledging that this was an issue to look at those times, I think. And only in the last maybe 10 years do people even think that's a good research topic. There's got to be something around, you know. I mean, there have to be, you know, people writing journals or, you know, or something, or at least talking to family members. But it's a really, I mean, it's a very important question. I think one of the other things that happened, and this is true, I'm sorry to cut you guys off, 1 second. One of the things that's very important with this issue as well is that a lot of women who went through these kinds of things, of course, didn't talk about it because, not only because of the general attitude in society, the kind of sexist attitude that blamed them for whatever happened or whatever, but also because the consequences they could have in their own family and community for doing that. And this is unfortunately something that, again, runs the gamut. Bosnia, the comfort women victimized by Japan in 38 to 45, who were, you know, basically sexual slaves under horrific conditions. I mean, just unbelievably horrific conditions. Very few of them ever came forward because they were, and even when they did, a lot of times their own governments and communities would ever really attack them. They said they were prostitutes and so forth. So there's all that kind of force on women not to have talked about this kind of stuff, and it's very brave women that actually did in the comfort women case and so forth. The testimony is probably there, but I know, you know, just knowing about this in the community, the things I know, I mean, I think that people really had women had an understandable resistance of making this a big issue because no one wanted to hear about it, and no one would support them in doing that. It's a great question. I mean, I have to say, some of these questions are just amazing, so that's a great question.
What was the role of the Armenian family surname in the carrying out of the program?
Great question. I have no idea. You mean in terms of who was targeted?
Well, identify. Were family surnames?
It's a good question.
You know, think about the Cambodian situation, where friends out of Cambodia, they changed their names because the surnames were a giveaway of who would be killed. There was a classification of
Oh, okay, yeah, there might have been factors, and also, of course, if you're in Cambodia and you're of Vietnamese descent, that was like the first target group, yeah, so it could be things like that. You know, that's a really good question. I mean, I know certainly there were Armenians who had converted to Islam, right, earlier, when we're starting to hear some of these kinds of things. And I assume their surnames changed, but, you know, I mean, that's a great question. I don't know exactly what the criteria were, but I think the Armenians, because of the Millet system, there was already a system in place that said who was Armenian and who was Turk, you know, and there was already a system there that would kind of clearly identify that. I mean, look at Rwanda, it's the same, you know, same kind of thing with the identity cards, you know, the Belgians had introduced, creating this idea of Tutsi and Hutu. You know, people were identified already, and that's very typical. But it's a great question. I don't know the history of that, and I don't know how much research has been done on that. Again, it's more of a historical question, but that's great.
Yeah.
Regarding your explanation of that, one side of what Young Turks, their approach in terms of they started democratization of the society, and then they understood that they cannot make further steps because it could change the society so much as one part of a reason for genocide. But in the meantime, I consider more important the other side, where Young Turks, as being more educated than Abdul Hamid and guys before him, they came with idea also, and this idea was also very strong, to unite all Turkish-speaking people, to unite all Turkish people on Anatolia, including Caucasus and Middle Asia. And there are several, actually numerous expressions made by young...
A good example, a good counterexample, or a good different kind of example, or I guess contrary example from history, is looking at the Scottish identity and political life after being conquered by the English in the formation of Great Britain, if you go back to like 1700s, early 1700s. What happened to the Scottish is very interesting. They, of course, resisted for a long time the encroachment of the English. So the English eventually conquered them. But once they conquered the Scottish said, okay, we're conquered. And then they became full participants. And arguments are that the Scottish, even more than the English, became the kind of predominant, you know, Anglo force in British colonization around the world. And if you look at, I mean, again, from a philosophical standpoint, 1700s is like the Scottish century of philosophy, like David Hume and so many others. And so it would have been, why wouldn't they have held, you know, as much as I would like to think, oh, Armenians are great, we'd never do something like that. The reality is, I mean, Armenians, like anybody else, and we have our good and our bad in our community, I mean, certainly there would have been Armenians who were willing to sign on to that project of conquest with Turkey. I mean, they would have been willing to do it if they were offered that. But why was it that the Turkish kind of nationalists couldn't even conceive of having Armenians involved in that project?
The religion.
Well, yeah, I mean, again, it's because they couldn't accept Armenians as equals, you know, for that reason.
It would be possible that the Armenians would have been the last significant millet in Anatolia, and the Young Turks saw the Ottoman Empire as the millet structure. So from a political perspective, looking at the millet, it had to go because the Ottoman Empire had to go. Do you follow that? It's a structural thing. That's what,
yeah, I mean, yeah, no, I see what you're saying. Yeah, I would say that the millet system didn't so much have to go as it was already gone.
They wanted it to go to. That was one of their motivations.
Right.
No question.
Right. But it was already gone, and so once you have the idea that Armenians are going to be part of this project, and then other people say Armenians can't be part of this project, they can't be part of this society, there's no place to put them, right? I mean, it's consistent with what you're saying. I don't think I'm exactly arguing against what you're saying, but there's no place to put Armenians. There's no, you know, there's nowhere Armenians can go at this point in the Ottoman Empire / this new Turkish state that's emerging. It doesn't exist. Now, if there were a liberal Ottoman Empire, you know, the Ahmed Reza version, there was a place Armenians could be. They could be integrated into it as Armenians and participate. But once you give up that, and you also have lost the millet system, you've got no place for them. And I think we agree that there's nothing left. So I agree there.
It's a very it's very pessimistic one.
1, 2, 3, 4.
In terms of finding any kind of women's stories,
Mhm.
seems that abuse doesn't get really developed as a popular subject until women's liberation.
You're absolutely right,
So there's
yeah.
a problem
Yeah.
with what happened.
For Armenians, yeah, a lot of that history is gone. It exists, I think, within family knowledge of what happened in some cases, but even there, I mean, a lot of stuff gets lost or edited. I mean, you know, and
Well, that's because it's behind the same shade.
right.
Same shadow.
It's you know, some people may know about it, other people don't know about it. And there's all the ways in which women dealt with trauma to try to survive and so forth. I mean, but you're right. I think you're right that that's a huge issue in terms of getting the information.
I know there are a lot of questions, but there's also cake.
But they-
Questions, cake.
How about Joe? Joe's been waiting patiently.
Yes, everybody
Can
has.
you comment on current Turkish attitudes? I know there's not one single attitude, but in terms of this superiority and so forth.
Can I say something controversial to get me in a lot of trouble?
Yeah.
I've struggled with this a lot in terms of my own self-understanding, you know, as an Armenian and all the, you know, things. Okay, you know, do I feel resentful to the point where I kind of have a prejudice against Turks or something like that? I really tried to think about all these kinds of things, particularly in the last 5 years around this dialogue and reconciliation thing. But one of the things that's been a real sticking point for me, and again, is part of the whole point of this exercise and trying to rethink how the framework we use to talk about the Armenian Genocide, is that there have just been a number of interactions I've had with Turks who are supposed to be progressive and maybe even acknowledge the Armenian Genocide, with Turks who are deniers, whatever. And one of the running things, and you gotta understand, I'm a white guy in the United States, you know, growing up on all the, you know, my psyche is to be part of the majority, and I don't get treated with racism. I don't get treated as a second-class citizen. You know, I'm educated, all that kind of stuff. But there are points when I've been interacting with people where the level of condescension and dismissal of me, presumably as an Armenian or somebody putting out positions on this, is pretty significant. I've had that actually even as Azeri consulate officials once when I was giving a talk. I'm just incredibly disrespectful and condescending. And I don't know, you know, maybe that's just part of the game, you know, game of dealing with genocide, that's just an attitude that people are going to have. It's like, you know, just to try to intimidate you or whatever. But even with progressive people, I feel like there's a residual there that hasn't been dealt with at all. It's not about getting along nicely with people. That's not the issue right now. It's about a deeper relation of dominance, as I was saying. And I felt that. And maybe because I'm a white guy, I'm oversensitive to it because I'm not used to feeling it in other contexts, but I've definitely felt that from places where I wouldn't have expected it, and it's been irritating. I mean, I've been condescended to by, you know, one time in a discussion, I won't get into the details, but I was kind of condescended to, and I don't claim to be the world's expert on denial, but, you know, people like Israel Charney and I, you know, get along very well on these things, and you know, at least I'm not, you know, completely off base on a lot of stuff that I've written on this. And I got actually told by a progressive kind of semi-admitter of the Armenian Genocide that I didn't understand denial in a public context. And I was just, you know, because I was talking about the scientific manipulation of evidence standards, or the manipulation of scientific evidence standards, which is a philosophical concern of mine, that deniers use to manipulate how we see history and truth and all these kinds of things. And I was told I didn't get denial, what was at stake with Turkish denial, in front of an audience, right? And just in a kind of condescending way where the person wouldn't give it up after, you know, a number of minutes of just telling me this. And I'm just thinking, you know, would I sit down in an audience, okay, we're going to have a Native American speaker, you know, and would I tell that person, you don't understand the condition of a colonized people, you know, from standing in the audience? And I would say, even if I might disagree with the position a person was taking, I can understand that, you can disagree, but would I be kind of, you know, would I take it to the level of almost, you know, combating that person in public, you know, rather than just stating a different opinion? And I think, and I don't want to overblow a few instances, but I think, you know, just when I read stuff that a lot of, you know, in Turkish newspapers, in other kinds, I don't read Turkish, but I mean translated stuff, I mean, there's this attitude of Armenians that we're still in the same place. There's still an imperial attitude. And of course, this is nothing new for anybody, you know, in the post-colonial world. That's everywhere. But I think that's kind of where I feel this is really significant and has an impact. And there needs to be a moment that even progressive Turks really need to think about that in a serious way. You know, that it's more than just admitting the genocide, but it's changing the effects of the genocide, changing the result, in a deeper way than just saying if we admit the genocide, then Turkey will become democratic and everything will be fine. The United States has been democratic for a long time, but we still committed genocide against Native Americans. We still had slavery. That's not the problem. Democracy is just part of the issue, but it's a much deeper problem of dealing with these kinds of attitudes, and I still see them. I mean, I don't feel that I'm victimized in a deep sense, partly because I'm in the U.S. and I can kind of, I don't have to live under Turkish rule or something like that, but some Armenians do. And certainly the Republic lives under the shadow of Turkish foreign policy. And I think those are where these issues become really important. If that's an answer. No cake?
Two more really fast questions and I guess fast answers. Yeah, no, go, please.
Okay, I believe there are many reasons why the Armenians got massacred, some got mentioned. But isn't it also the fact that the Europeans played their game with Turkey for their own interests, with the reforms of the Armenians and the human rights of the Armenians and the rights of whatever, and we ended up really paying the price because they pushed Turkey too much?
I mean, that's like the Dadrian kind of approach in a lot of ways. There was this idea of external intervention. It's also can
Which
be...
they're doing it now in EU. EU is turning and doing the same thing. It's playing with the Armenian genocide.
Right. Certainly there's always these issues of exploiting human rights issues. I mean, in the world of today where human rights is a big issue, it gets exploited constantly. Not to say that there shouldn't be intervention in places like Sudan. I don't mean to say that. But it is to say that you're exactly right, that this stuff gets manipulated because if it's useful, it's used. If it isn't, we all know Armenians were abandoned, 1 year, and they were the top story the next year and things like that. And we see that continuing in our own age. There are many different causes of a genocide, and I don't mean to say that what I'm suggesting is it, and I want to say that I think that things come together, and that's how you get a genocide. It's not just one thing, which is a lot of times how people think about genocide. It's really, you have to have a lot of different people and players and attitudes. Israel Charney, by the way, gives a great example of this when he talks about an SS officer. He remembers the film Holocaust, the miniseries Holocaust, back in like 79 or 82, I can't remember when it was, slightly before my time, but not much. And he tells about one captain in the SS who was a big participant in the Holocaust, who wasn't anti-Semitic at all. He didn't hate Jews, he didn't care, but he saw the Holocaust as a means of career advancement. By the way, which is why some deniers deny the Armenian Genocide. They're not ideologues. They just, hey, Heath Lowry, could he have ever gotten a really good job any other way? Probably not. This is a great way for him to get a great job because he hasn't done anything significant as an academic. It's true. People say this. Anyway, but yeah. So there could be all sorts of different things that are playing into this, and I think you're right to talk about all these factors. And if it were just one thing, genocide is easy to stop, right? If it's just one problem, we can deal with that. But if it's many problems, it becomes much more complicated because if you cut one problem, there are all these other things, and a lot of the emphasis just shifts over into some other kind of avenue of hatred and domination and so forth. So I think you're right. As a complementary point, I would certainly agree that and some of the other things that have come up are very important as well. And it depends on who you're talking about. And Young Turks, a single perpetrator of genocide or planner of the genocide at one point may think one way, another point, we're not all thinking the same way all the time. So all these things could roll together. And so I think that's important. Yeah. So I guess there's cake.
Begin, speak. Wait. Begin, speak, please, quickly.
Yes?
Yes!
Okay. I have a question. I'll give you the reason why the question.
Please do.
Do you have a significant library collection on the genocide? Do you have any unique, don't answer it's like pose the question completely. Do you have any unique documentation concerning the genocide? And the reason I'm saying that, I'm working with Professor Papazian. We're having a major library, genocide, manuscript, archives, digital center, and the University of Michigan gives it a huge place. It's under construction now. We'd like to know what you have to tie in with you. I'll see you after.
Yeah, I have to say not much, given my background as not being a historian.
But they haven't collected any, you haven't collected.
Yeah, it's not my area. I just hope other people do a good job and
Henry,
use their work.
Thank you. This will help you purchase some.
Thank you all. I really appreciate it. Did I mention the busy cake? do that. Thank you. And I'll be around, so. You know.